Hello there, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. In the last few days, we've been talking a lot about the transition of the Republic Navy to the Imperial Navy. We just recently found out, thanks to Tales of the Empire and the Bad Batch, that the mighty Venator had at least another 5 to 10 years of service in the Empire. Which means, thankfully, not all of these ships ended up on Ferrix or Baraka in massive scrapyards. Better yet, we found out that the Venator-class Star Destroyer was actually deployed alongside the Imperial-class Star Destroyer, making for some truly formidable fleets. We also discussed the eventual replacement of the Venator-class Star Destroyer, the Quasar-Fire-class cruiser carrier, which at first glance seems like a huge step backwards for the Empire. But a closer look at this cost-effective light carrier reveals a very important truth about the Empire. Despite how loud its bark might seem, despite all of its posturing, despite the Tarkin doctrine and this idea of scaring the population into submission, the Empire's grasp of the galaxy for most of its reign was relatively weak, not that much stronger than the Republic's in many ways, and the stronger and the harder that Palpatine tried to clamp down and squeeze his fists around the galaxy, well, the more worlds would kind of slip through the cracks, like little grains of sand. Especially in the Outer Rim territories, where the biggest challenges weren't terrifying Xeno races or pirate kings, but just the massive expanse of territory and ground you need to cover. The leaders of the Galactic Republic were smart enough to understand that trying to pacify this entire wide territory was just a losing battle, and they really didn't have the political or economic will to do so. There's really just no political incentive for the political leaders of the Senate, who mostly hailed from the core regions, to invest so heavily in a territory where they didn't have any constituents in. The Rusan Reformation also eliminated the Republic military, so pacification wasn't even really a possibility. And so instead, the Republic tried to attract investment and capital to the region by creating a free trade zone, which of course created another set of problems. And those problems would eventually lead to the Clone Wars. But in my opinion, this was still a better option than what the Empire tried to do, which was occupy the entire Outer Rim with its military force and then try its best to exploit as much resources as possible without a credit of investment to the local economy or infrastructure. You know, in movies and science fiction, we always see these evil dictators who take, destroy, but in real life, people like that, they end up dead pretty quickly because the populace will overthrow them, or they'll just screw over so many people that they'll get what's coming to them. And that's just how the world works. And smart people know to tread carefully and not to fling bullshit when unnecessary. Now, in the core regions of the galaxy, in the larger, more populated sectors, you had impressive fleets of Star Destroyers. These were 1.6 kilometer long vessels, which inspired fear and awe in the civilian populace when they floated overhead. But there were some serious limitations to this platform, and also these ships represented a crazy concentration of resources in just one ship, which could never really be a solution to the Outer Rim's problems. This was a sparsely populated area that was extremely spread out, and so very quickly it became apparent that the Empire had to find smaller ships for these kind of operations in order to create the quantity of military forces they needed to keep some semblance of order in this area. But even then, it was very difficult. And so in the Outer Rim territories, the Imperial-class Star Destroyer played a much smaller, almost ceremonial role. It would fly from system to system as a reminder of Imperial dominance, just like how during the Vietnam War, American units had control over most of the hamlets in South Vietnam during the daytime, but at nighttime, the Viet Cong would come out and just cause chaos. It wasn't until American units embedded into the villages, started working alongside the villagers, helping them plant, fields during the day, and then in return, these citizens would help the American forces patrol at night. That was the only time they were able to actually create some kind of peace in these areas. And so there's a heavy amount of investment needed to pacify a region. You can't just show up in a gigantic starship and expect things to work. And so very quickly, local governors in these areas had to put together ad hoc task forces that were actually appropriate for the types of threats that the Empire faced in these regions, primarily pirates and smugglers. Ships so small that they could easily fit into a blind spot on an Imperial-class Star Destroyer and maintain undetected. And so what we see local Imperial governors basically rely on in almost every Outer Rim sector are primarily 3 ships: the Corellian designed and manufactured Gazanti-class cruiser, the Archidans-class command cruiser, or light Imperial cruiser, and of course the Quasar-Fire-class carrier cruiser we talked about in the last video. Notice all of these ships have that cruiser designation, despite all being built in very different sizes and for different purposes. The cruiser designation here simply refers to the one thing that all of these platforms share, and that is the ability to travel long distances at reasonable speeds without having to resupply. I mean, these ships are not necessarily big hitters at all. When we think about the term Imperial capital ship, these are not it. They also aren't heavily armed and designed for heavy action. You're not going to find any of these vessels in the vanguard of a larger Imperial sector fleet. Instead, what these ships specialized in is just patrolling large expanses. Now, as far as size goes, the Arcanon's-class command cruiser is 230 meters long, the Quasar-Fire-class carrier cruiser is 340 meters in length, and the Gazanti-class cruiser is just 63.8 meters in length. And these ships are actually very similar in size to what the Old Republic used to patrol the galaxy for thousands of years. For instance, the Old Republic's most popular capital ship for almost 4,000 years was the Hammerhead-class cruiser, and it was just around 315 meters in length. The Old Republic survived like 1,000 times longer than the Empire almost, and so it probably figured out pretty quickly that these medium-sized vessels were the perfect blend of firepower, cost, and speed. And yes, back in those days, they had to face the Sith Empire, and the Sith Empire generally had larger, more triangle-shaped ships, and they usually got their ass handed to them. Once the Old Republic's economy kicked into war mode, that is. And this is why these three ships are so important to the Empire's overall strategy. They really do fit the needs that they have in the Outer Rim, and as awesome as the Imperial-class Star Destroyer might look, it's a very cool-looking ship. The best ships that you have in a battle are usually the ships you bring to the battle. And I, for one, much rather have a dinky Gazanti-class cruiser that actually arrives on time rather than the promise of an ISD from the local sector capital coming to the rescue. And that's because usually the rebels have already left by the time the ISDs arrive and the Imperial installation is already on fire and in ruins. So anyway, let's take a look at the Gazanti-class cruiser. In my opinion, one of the least sexy ships in the Empire, but probably also the most criminally underrated. And here's why. It's just one simple thing. The Gazanti-class cruiser costs around 200,000 credits. That's about the price of 3 TIE fighters, and just a little more expensive than an X-Wing. For the price of an Imperial-class Star Destroyer, you can build and operate at least 750 of these vessels, and potentially even more depending on the configuration. Again, I don't care how powerful Imperial-class Star Destroyers' turbolasers are, it can't be in 750 different locations at the same time, and when you're dealing with descent all across the galaxy, that is exactly what you need. And the Gazanti was not only, smaller than the Imperial-class Star Destroyer, it was also one of the most popular civilian freighter models that Corellian Engineering Corporation was selling. This ship was preferred not only by the Empire's most remote outposts, it was also beloved by smugglers, criminal organizations like the Black Sun, who had their own variant. The Separatists also used these ships as well. And so unlike the ISD, which was purpose-built for the Imperial military in very limited numbers, 25,000 seems like a lot, but I wouldn't be surprised if CEC was pumping out 25,000 Gazanti-class cruisers a month. When you scale up a product like this by selling it to the civilian market, you can increase your manufacturing numbers significantly and decrease cost per unit. This rarely happens though, because you're usually not selling military hardware to civilians, but in America we did that with the Humvee, and I'm pretty sure that the barebone H1s that were sold to the public were far cheaper than what the US government paid for that first batch from AM General. Now, just because the Gazanti-class cruiser was kind of cheap didn't mean it was a scrub. The Empire had their own special modified version straight from the factory. That's what happens when you order enough. Manufacturers will customize the crap out of your order. As a result, the Imperial Gazanti-class cruisers were wider than the standard variant with additional protection over the engines. They were also equipped with a dorsal twin laser cannon turret and a ventral heavy laser cannon turret alongside docking points for either 4 TIE fighters or 2 walkers. These are basically all the tools you really need to handle like 90% of the threats in the Outer Rim. It was on the Gazanti-class cruiser where you actually saw the Empire do a lot of good work and not just oppress people for no reason. There were real security concerns in the Outer Rim territories. The whole area was just a mess. And the Empire didn't really have a firm foothold in many of these areas, and so it was here that many young, aspiring officers were tested and either overcame the adversity presented to them or were just sucked into the cold, dark void and forgotten with time. Because in the Outer Rim, the Empire couldn't just blunt force their way to a solution for every problem. They had to do something that the Empire rarely does, which is compromise with local settlements and local citizens. As a result, some of the finest officers in the Empire started their career on such freighters. Like Grand Admiral Thrawn and his aide Eli Vanto, they would flourish during their time on the Blood Crow, traveling around the peripherals of the galaxy, solving local disputes and freeing pirates from life. Thrawn would quickly rise to the rank of first weapons officer. These ships were still large enough where they needed a fully functioning crew and command chain to operate at maximum efficiency. But at the same time, there usually weren't enough people on board where you can have too many specialists, and so your weapons officer and comms officer might also be a part of the way team while you make first contact with an alien species species or infiltrating a dangerous hive of villainy. Thrawn also found the Gazanti spacious enough to store his own trinkets and knickknacks he collected during his travel. Remember, this thing is a freighter first and a combat ship second. I've always said this, the Gazanti-class cruiser is the Ford Econoline of the Star Wars galaxy. They ship you the box. It's really up to you what you put inside of it. And during the early rebellion period, when you had many smaller localized cells who were still not linked up together as a larger rebellion, the Gazanti class was enough. I mean, put together 3 of these and you had a full TIE fighter squadron and 3 decent gunships to support them. More than enough to handle most skirmishes. But eventually, the alliance to restore the Republic would emerge, and soon the Gazanti class cruiser was getting outgunned by Hammerhead corvettes and CR-90 corvettes, 2 of the most popular capital ships used by the early rebellion. And of course, these Gazantis were also vulnerable to the potent rebel starfighter core, but so were most Imperial vessels. At least the Gazanti had some ability to defend itself thanks to its point defense weapons. Now, when the Empire needed a bit more firepower in the Outer Rim, that is when the Archidans class command cruiser comes into play. Introduced during the Republic era, this light cruiser would be retrofitted as part of a service life extension program for the Empire. The ship's speed, agility, and firepower would all be increased, but interestingly enough, after that initial batch of upgrades, the Empire would continue to make brand new Archidan class light cruisers that are based on these modifications. And that's something that the Empire never did with the Venator class Star Destroyers, and that's because the Archidans was something they desperately needed. Now, when we think of command vessels in the Imperial Navy, we typically think of the Executor class Super Star Destroyer, a 19-kilometer long beast that basically dwarfed everything aside from planetary bodies and Death Stars. And they really wouldn't be all that useful until the Galactic Civil War was in full swing. For the most part, it was the Archidans class command cruiser which was doing all of the heavy lifting, especially in the Outer Rim. These ships were used to coordinate groups of Gazanti-class cruisers along with any supporting Quasar Fire-class frigates. Everything in the Outer Rim is scaled down in size and firepower, and so the Archidans-class command cruiser was more than enough for most engagements. For instance, during the skirmish over Ibar, a blockade of Gazanti-class cruisers led by an Archidans-class command cruiser absolutely devastated a rebel supply convoy with several CR-90 corvettes. And that's thanks to the very healthy armament on board the ship, which includes 4 turret-mounted light turbo laser batteries, 4 concussion missile launchers, and 8 quad laser batteries. They could also store several fighters in a forward-facing hangar, which could be modified to even accommodate more ships. And then, of course, we have the last piece of the puzzle, the Quasar Fire-class cruiser carrier with its 4 squadron of fighters on board, enough to represent a huge threat to any rebel fleet and any rebel capital ship. These 3 vessels form the core to the Empire's response to all threats in this part of the galaxy. And it's no coincidence that this configuration represents something closer to the old Republic strategy, because sometimes there's really just one way to beat off a dead horse. Or something like that. Now, of course, these 3 ships alone couldn't pacify the Outer Rim. They just represented the most efficient use of military resources to create the best security outcomes in the Outer Rim. Ultimately, all of the money invested into these military forces for the Outer Rim will have to be subsidized by the core regions and the more populated regions of the galaxy, something that the Empire's managed democracy could easily force onto the population. But the only way that these kind of peacekeeping operations can work in the long run is if you can establish permanent settlements and actually attract people to live in these areas. Maybe you can introduce programs to convince not corporations, but individuals or maybe families to move to the Outer Rim to set up homes, businesses, villages, and then eventually cities. If the Empire actually built things, protected people, there would be no shortage of volunteers for the Imperial Navy. And eventually, when you have a large enough population, the tax base levied from those cities and settlements will be more than enough to fund these military forces, which is really the stability you need. There are no shortcuts to this process. It takes a long time to build a settlement, to build a planet, to build a nation. Unfortunately, the Empire was not into actual solutions that required work and long-term investment. Slavery and stealing resources are completely chaotic behaviors that only create more problems down the road. Individuals like Moff Wilhuff Tarkin are portrayed as strong-willed and competent leaders, but in reality, Tarkin was a fool of a man, driven by his bloodlust and impatience for dissent. Instead of creating a better quality of life in the Outer Rim, Tarkin drove good Imperial officers away from him. He encouraged dissent through his very punitive actions. It was just not a good idea for him to be in charge. And all of these problems that Tarkin envisioned, well, they actually had nothing to do with the rebels. That was just a symptom of the wider problems in the galactic economy. A lack of investment, a lack of security, and everything else a happy populace would need is just missing here. Ultimately, I believe that the Imperial-class Star Destroyer and its many other variations represent a not-so-serious attempt to govern. Only goons and tin-pot dictators hide behind their massive military machines, and that is because they can't really champion anything else they've done from an economic or social point of view, because they most likely have focused way too much energy on building up that military. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy. I'll see you next time.